So far in this chapter, we've talked about some of the associations between smell and emotion and behaviors, taste and emotion and particular behaviors. We also have associations between sight and emotion and particular behaviors. So we form associations between sensory information and particular behaviors. We are primed to do so. This is adaptive. And the adaptiveness of associating particular sensory stimuli with particular behaviors is based upon our environment. So we can have evolutionary influences on behavior that persist in their adaptiveness across generations. So even if you have never touched a snake before, you would have a higher likelihood of being afraid of it. So, and this is something that this is an epigenetic or influence that is passed down. And how does this occur? That we have things that we could be fearful of even before we have even experienced them. And so one of the ways this occurs is through an innate releasing mechanism. This is a hypothetical mechanism that detects specific sensory stimuli and directs an organism to take a particular behavior. And again, this is hypothetical, but so they're still trying to figure out what some of the specific and physical and biological mechanisms that would make this so. But there is evidence that suggests that we do have these innate releasing mechanisms. So to have this occur, where we just detect a specific sensory stimuli and it can direct an organism to take a particular action, the brain must have a set of norms against which it can match stimuli so as to trigger an appropriate response. So we must have some sort of idea of in-wired, danger. And then this would again trigger some sort of appropriate response. And these innate releasing mechanisms can be relatively subtle. So it can be, for example, that if we were to see a sad or an angry face, that even if we had never really seen one before, theoretically, of course, because we've seen tons of faces, but if we'd never really seen one before, then we would be more likely to have one response than another. And there's also things that would be triggered based upon what would be advantageous for the organism. So again, we're speaking in these sort of broad evolutionary contexts, that what is the primary items in the environment that are beneficial for the organism are food. Food is a primary reinforcer. It's what we need. It's basic for survival, and sex as it relates to procreation. And so even the sense that if we were to see someone that we would think is attractive, then we would have, our body would sort of automatically engage in some sort of appropriate response that would be conducive to, exhibiting some of the attractiveness that you feel, or even building upon that, making out, sort of these initial stages of courtship, the sort of, you see someone that you're attracted to, makes you want to do things with them. Even this is going to be related to a biologically adaptive behavior in regards to procreation of a species. So please bear in mind that I am not advocating for, making out or sex. I'm just trying to help put some of the behaviors that we exhibit in a scientific and evolutionary context in terms of why we have some of the reactions that we do. Behaviors that we exhibit and that are adaptive exist because the neural circuits producing them have been favored through natural selection. A reinforcer is an example of an event that strengthens the behavior that follows it. So in operant conditioning, a reinforcer is any event that strengthens the behavior that follows it. So this could be reward. So this can strengthen the relationship between a particular behavior and a particular reward. And in this way, experience shapes behavior by pairing stimuli and reinforcers. So we learn to do particular things, or how to act, or how to behave, or what's important, what's not important, by making choices and associating those choices with particular outcomes. If the outcome is favorable, then we're going to be more likely to make that choice in the future. If the outcome is not favorable, then we're going to be less likely to make that choice or that behavior in the future. And this basic pairing or associating of an action, choice, or behavior and a positive or negative outcome, this is behind many, many complex behaviors. Learning takes place in a brain that has been selected for evolutionary adaptations. So you can train pigeons, dogs, animals to do all sorts of things, basically by giving them reinforcers, primary reinforcers, which would be food, or rewarding them at particular instances so that they associate a particular action with a reward, and they're going to be more likely to complete that action. We have similar pairings all the time. Things that we're more likely to do in a particular circumstance. This can be, okay, if we are sad and we eat food, and we eat like chocolate or ice cream, and that food is yummy, and so that sort of elevates our mood a little bit, then we're going to be more likely to use food in the future to regulate our mood. We're going to be more likely to work harder in the future for jobs, for bosses who reward or compliment good behavior. You're going to be less likely to do something after you are punished. So all of the complex behaviors that we engage in on a daily basis in terms of what is and is not appropriate have fundamentally been shaped by reinforcers. So to take this back to some of the simplistic sensory associations, we have learned taste aversion. So learned taste aversion is an acquired association between a specific taste or odor and illness, can lead to an aversion to foods having that taste or odor. So this is something that is, again, advantageous, that if we were to have had something that made us feel ill, then this is a basic stimulus reinforcer relationship. We've engaged in a particular behavior, eating a food, and we had a particular outcome, which was a negative taste or odor or illness, and then we would learn to avoid that food. So food poisoning is an example of this. It can be very, very strong. So you can persist in an aversion to a food. It is advantageous for these aversions to become really strong, because if you've had food poisoning once, you would know that you really don't want to do it again. And if you were to think back, when we don't have the medical advances that we have now, then experiencing food poisoning could actually be really debilitating and could actually possibly have led to death. So to give you an example of how powerful some of these associations are, I'm sure everybody has some examples of food poisoning or something. My husband got food poisoning once after eating a rice and pork meal that his aunt had made. And it was the pork that was rancid and gave him food poisoning. And so he threw up afterwards. But what happened, and which is interesting, is that he has an aversion for rice, because when he was throwing up, he had this sort of association of, what did he throw up? The rice. And that when the rice sort of, was coming up from his stomach and leaving his mouth, and that sort of the taste of the rice in his mouth, the feel of the rice, the small grains, throwing that stuff up, then he can now no longer eat rice because of that feeling of it in his mouth. And he can still eat pork, but he can no longer eat rice. So I thought that was a good example of how you can have very strong learned taste aversions, and what your body automatically associates, and in this case it was rice and less pork, is a little bit a variable based upon the context. Our body is also prepared to respond in particular ways. So this is known as preparedness, in which we have a predisposition to respond to certain stimuli differently than other stimuli. So our brain is pre-wired to make certain types of associations, but not others. We are very wired to make associations between food and smell and health. And this is so as to avoid the prospect of being poisoned or eating food that could poison us. So we form associations between food, smell, and health very, very easily, and it can be really, really hard to distinguish them. And so we can have greater preparedness for certain types of associations that make it easier to associate, and we can have lower preparedness for other types of associations. So when we're learning about these associations between emotion and behavior and how food and taste and particular emotions can affect our behavior, it's important to know the structures in the brain that are critical for these associations. So first we have the hypothalamus and the associated pituitary gland. So this sends information to other brain system circuits to produce behavior. It's highly involved in the release and production of hormones, and so it's really central to your emotional response system. In addition, we also have the limbic system and the frontal lobes. Both of these project to the hypothalamus. So again, you're going to have variation in your emotional response regions in the brain and your limbic system, in your regulatory response region in the brain, which is your frontal lobes, and variation in these is going to project to your hypothalamus to influence the release of hormones. We also have a homeostatic mechanism. This is a process that maintains critical body functions within a narrow fixed range. So this keeps our temperature at a certain level, our pH balance at certain levels, stuff like that. The hypothalamus is involved in hormone secretions. So what then are some of the factors that are involved in controlling the release of hormones through the hypothalamus? One is we have feedback loops. Feedback loops control the amount of hormone that is released. And so basically this would be the equivalent of saying, okay, well, we're sending a whole lot of information, and then whoever's ever receiving that information. So I'm sending a whole lot of information to you, and then when you receive that information, you would come back and tell me, message received. So then I would stop sending that information. That's a basic feedback loop. You send something, message received, and then the message is no longer sent. You also have neural regulation. So other brain regions, the limbic system and the frontal lobes, for example, they actually influence hormone release. So you can try to regulate certain regions of your brain to try to influence the amount of hormones released. So in this sense, feedback loops control the amount of hormone that is released via the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus releases hormones, and then the glands in the endocrine system, for example, that receive these hormones will then send the hypothalamus messages saying like, okay, look, we've received these hormones, you can stop sending them. And then we have neural regulation, the brain regions that are then trying to regulate the initial release of information from the hypothalamus. And then last you have experiential responses. So experience can actually alter the structure and function of hypothalamic neurons, and in this way they can become more sensitive to particular types of behavior or less sensitive to particular types of behavior, so they can be more likely to release hormones or less likely as a function of certain experiences. It's also critical to know that the hypothalamus is involved in generating behavior. So it's not just that the hypothalamus, you sort of send off hormones, and it's not just some sort of hormonal machine. Send the hormones, okay, hormones, received, stop sending hormones, stop sending hormones. The hypothalamus is also involved in generating behavior, beginning behavior. So some of these hormones can be used to start specific behavioral responses. And if you were to actually stimulate different nuclei in the hypothalamus, then that will produce goal-directed behaviors, such as eating and drinking, digging, displaying fear, predatory attack behavior, or reproductive behavior. So it's really important to know that the hypothalamus does these things when you stimulate it, because you're going to naturalistically stimulate your hypothalamus throughout the course of your life. And, particular things that you do, so this hypothalamus becomes stimulated, again, it will produce or help generate goal-directed behaviors, so that it can help you sort of think, okay, I need to start eating or drinking something. We don't do a lot of digging in terms of our species. That's something that would be more for other types of animals. But something that would be akin to that would be engaging in nesting or cleaning behavior. So our hypothalamus can stimulate us to engage in sort of nesting or cleaning behavior, displaying fear, engaging in predatory or attack behavior. It can tell us when it would be a particularly ideal time to reproduce. And so if we can show that these behaviors occur when we artificially stimulate the hypothalamus through electrical current, then we know that it is in fact the hypothalamus that is involved in generating or releasing the hormones that would be involved in generating these behaviors. In addition to the hypothalamus, we also talked about the limbic region. And the limbic circuit or limbic region is a very primitive region of the brain, and meaning that it is quite evolutionarily old. And it comprises the cingulate gyrus and the hippocampus formation, or the hippocampal formation. The hippocampus is a distinctive three-layered subcortical structure of the limbic system that it lies in the medial temporal region. It plays a role in species-specific behaviors, memory, and spatial navigation. It's also quite vulnerable to the effects of stress. So the hippocampus is really important for memory and for spatial navigation. And if you have damage to your hippocampus, and if the damage is extensive enough and it covers both sides, so if you have bilateral damage to the hippocampus, then you can have memory problems, meaning that you can't actually form new memories. So we'll be talking about that a little bit more in later chapters. The hippocampus is also vulnerable to the effects of stress in that it gets smaller, so you can have less neuronal generation, so the less formation of new neurons in the hippocampus, and that can result in a smaller hippocampus. And this, since the hippocampus is involved in new memory formation, if it's smaller, then this is going to affect the type of memories that you can form and that you can recall. And so it might make it more challenging to engage in broader use of your memories and formation of newer memories that align with trying to change your mood. For example, the hippocampus is shown to be smaller in depressed individuals. Well, if it's smaller, then it might make it more challenging to try to engage in forming new positive memories, for example. We also have the parahippocampus, also known as the parahippocampal cortex, and this is also involved in processing memories. Here is the organization of the limbic circuit. So here's your hippocampus, here's your parahippocampus, right here. Together these make up the hippocampal formation. Here's your amygdala, which we'll be learning a little about more shortly. You have your thalamus in here. This is your cingulate gyrus. It's a large region, and it subserves a variety of functions. This shows here your connectivity of these regions. So you have your prefrontal cortex. This is sending connections through your cingulate. You have some sensory information coming in from your sensory cortex. This is again traveling through your cingulate into your hippocampus here, influencing your amygdala. All of this also sends information or has connections with the hypothalamus, which again is going to influence the release of hormones. And together, the hypothalamus and the amygdala are especially important in emotional behavior, and we'll be learning more about that shortly. So the amygdala is generally thought of as the emotion processing region of the brain, and you're going to be learning more about it in this brief video here.
Well, the amygdala is a small region of the brain. It's in what's called the temporal lobe of the brain. If we divide the cerebral hemispheres into the four major lobes, occipital, temporal, parietal, and frontal, it's in the temporal lobe, which is under the temporal bone, which is behind your ear. And the amygdala would be located in at a point where a line that goes through your eye and through your ear intersect in your brain. So imagine like someone has shot an arrow through your eye and another one into your ear. Where those two come together would be roughly where it is, and on both sides of the brain, of course, because most structures, in fact all structures, are bilateral in that sense. So it's sometimes referred to as an almond or an almond-shaped structure, which is a bit of a misnomer because there's one part of it that's almond-shaped, and that caught the attention of early anatomists, and so they named this almond-shaped structure the amygdala. But as the amygdala began to be defined more broadly, it includes a lot of structures other than that little almond-shaped piece. It's most commonly associated with fear, although that's not its only function. It's its most heavily studied function, and the reason for that is that it's much easier to study fear than other emotions. Things that are bad have more weight than things that are good, in a sense. I mean, you can put off eating, drinking, sex, whatever, for an indefinite amount of time, but you have to respond to danger immediately. You don't find great novels about happy subjects. It's always about the bad stuff. And it's sometimes said that there's this negative bias in emotion, which is that most research on emotion is about the negative stuff. But the fact is that negative stuff turns out to be the most important for survival in a sense, in terms of immediacy and having to respond. Some of the key interconnections of the amygdala, and these connections actually define what it does in a sense, at least with respect to fear. The amygdala gets sensory information directly from the various sensory systems that process the external world. So the visual system, the auditory system, olfactory, touch, pain, and so forth. All of these kind of come together or converge in the amygdala. And then the amygdala connects on the output side with all the systems involved in emotional reactivity. So when you encounter sudden danger, you might freeze. Your blood pressure and heart rate begin to rise. Stress hormones are released. All these things happen as a result of outputs of the amygdala. So the amygdala you can think of as kind of this this circle with one input coming in being the input coming in being a sensory flow of sensory information from the external world, and then outputs being connections to systems involved in controlling the responses. So, but we have to expand those inputs. So it's getting not just one sensory input, but all sensory inputs. So each sensory system is coming in. And it doesn't stop there, because in addition to getting information from sensory systems, it also gets information from higher order systems like the prefrontal cortex and higher order association areas involved in various kinds of integrative activities in the cortex. What it does is a function of what connections it has. So because it has connections with all these sensory systems, it can take in information from the environment of a variety of types and use that information. And so if a sound in the external world occurs right before something painful happens, you associate that sound with the painful event, and that sound will then later trigger a protective defense response. But if the sound occurs just before food, when you're hungry, then the sound will be associated with that kind of a positive or a positive event. And so what the amygdala is doing is forming associations between random or neutral external stimuli and the kinds of reinforcing events that will stamp in those experiences in a stronger way. So it's creating these what's called Pavlovian associations. Stimulus 1 plus stimulus 2. If one of those is a biologically significant stimulus, then the other one will require some kind of biological significance itself, whether it's positive or negative. Now that information can then be used, and this is sort of what I think you were referring to in terms of adaptive behavior. So that CS-US relationship, or say sound-food relationship, can then be used to guide instrumental behavior, which is goal-directed behavior. So if in the past you've obtained food at a certain location, the stimuli that are proximal to that location serve as conditioned stimuli and are reinforcing to you because they're close to the actual goal, and they take you towards the goal. Same thing happens with aversive stimuli. It's just that it works in the opposite way.
So as you just had that nice little summary of the role of the amygdala, the amygdala is, part of the amygdala is at least almond shaped, and it's within the limbic system, and it has a very close connection with the hippocampus. And the amygdala plays a role in all sorts of species-specific behaviors that you learn. It receives input from all sensory systems and is multimodal. It can respond to more than one sensory modality. And the key thing that it does is it forms associations between two particular actions, a particular behavior, an outcome. It is an association-forming machine. And in particular, what it responds to is relevance. So the information that tends to be most relevant to us. So this is if you're going to form associations and you're going to pay attention to what associations you form and be thinking about forming adaptive ones, then you're going to be focusing on relevant information, forming associations with relevant information, and the information that tends to be the most relevant in our lives is that is emotional or linked with goals. And so goals or goal-related information can be quite emotional for us. So it looks for things that are relevant. And it's also been associated with fear, specifically because you do have to try to respond to fearful content really quickly. If you are in a particular situation and you're afraid and you don't act in a adaptive manner in terms of, okay, I'm going to respond right here, I'm going to fight, or I'm going to flee, or something like that, then you could have negative, consequences on your person. You could die, So the amygdala is particularly responsive to fear because it's adaptive, but really, in principle, it responds to all relevant emotional information.